Hello, back for some beef udon noodle soup. We're going to be using our beef stock that we made in our stocks unit. I froze it because that was a month or so ago, and then now I'm going to be using that to make my beef udon noodle soup. This soup I have kind of in two parts here. I'm going to take a moment and focus on my broth, because my finished product is going to be a noodle soup with a nice, rich, flavorful broth, and then I'll have some vegetables that I've sauteed and seasoned that I'll add into it. So I'll focus on getting the broth done first, getting my aromatics and other things to make it flavorful, strain it out, and then work on getting my vegetables done. So you will see on your recipe that you do have two parts there. So just getting right into it, I'm going to start with that broth. Like I said, I have my quart of beef stock that I made in the stocks unit. Had it in the freezer, and now I'm going to make my broth with it. So vegetable oil, I do need a teaspoon of vegetable oil. I'll get that in once I get all the rest of my mise en place done. I definitely have mise en place set up here, just ingredients, tools, equipment out, everything that I need out and ready to go. And then now I'm going to take my mise en place a step further with all of my knife work, getting everything cut and ready to go before I get any flame onto my pot, because I don't want my pot to be burning and getting really hot while I'm still trying to cut an onion or something. So I will need a teaspoon of vegetable oil. I'm going to need half of an onion julienne. And I like this recipe because I use half of an onion for the broth to flavor it, and then I'm going to use the other half down below for vegetables that I'm going to saute that's going to go in the soup. So you will use the whole onion at the end of the day there. I need 2 each garlic cloves smashed, 1 tablespoon fresh ginger sliced, 1 quart of beef stock. I need 1 each star anise. I need 3 whole coriander, 1 tablespoon soy sauce, 2 teaspoons of fish sauce, and half a bunch of fresh spinach. I'm going to add that to the very end of my broth with all my other vegetables. I'm going to go through all this as I mise en place, of course. So let's get into mise en placing. All right, so half an onion julienne. So a reminder with cutting our onion, I will trim off this root end here. I'm not gonna quite go all the way crazy deep, but I do wanna get that bottom end just kind of off of there, and then get the top end off of here. There's some of that slippery paper. Then now, done myself a favor, I have a really great flat spot here. So now my roly-poly vegetable is going to sit flat, and that's going to help me. So I'm just going to cut it in half through that root end, cut it in half through the root end, not the equator, but down through the root end here. I'll save the other half for my other part of my vegetables here, and just focus on half my onion. All right, so now I have half my onion, flat spot again. I'm gonna leave it on that flat spot. So now what I wanna do is julienne it. We've diced before, and we've always left this root end intact to kind of hold all of our layers together. We don't really need that right now. So I'm gonna take that root end off, and how I'm gonna do that is I'm just gonna make a simple cut, but at an angle. So I'm just gonna kind of angle cut here, and then now I'm left with this kind of funky triangle of that root end, but that root end should now be gone. And then now I'm just left with a bunch of usable onion. So for my julienne, I'll leave it on the flat spot, and I'll do that same cut that we kind of do with the dice, this kind of rainbow cut this. So using my claw, and my knife is kind of rest against that knuckle here, and on my first cuts will be kind of angled, and as I go over the top, it'll be up and down. And then as I get smaller here, I'll show you what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna flip things around. And then now as this starts to get smaller and smaller and harder to hold on to, and now my fingers are in some danger, I'm just gonna find a new flat spot and then just turn it over to something that is a little bit more wide and easier to hang on to, and I can still do it again. And then now I have a julienne. If I go to break these apart, it's a really nice julienne. This specific onion in this part of the recipe is just for my broth, just to flavor my broth. and it's going to eventually be strained out. So I'm not terribly concerned with how beautiful they are because I just want the flavor of the onion. They're going to be strained out, no one will see them. The other vegetables I'm going to leave in my broth. I want them to be a little bit more visually appealing because they're going to stay in my broth and I want them to be pretty. All right, 2 garlic cloves smashed. Again, we're just taking these bits that are going into the broth to flavor it. All we're trying to do is flavor my broth. Kind of like fortifying my stock here. So any steps that I take that I'm going to be making my stock tasty, I'm eventually going to strain out, with the exception of the spinach. The spinach I'm going to add at the very end. But all of these things I'm putting in here, I'm going to strain out. So I'm not going to be super crazy particular with, I don't need to smash or take this further and dice it. If it has some paper on it, I'm not really going to spend all that much time taking all of it off. So smashed garlic. Two cloves. And now ginger. So I have fresh ginger root here. You might see this at the store. And you can usually just kind of break off like a finger of it, of whatever you need. But it's really, really fibrous. You can kind of see the fibers that are sticking out here on the ends. And again, I'm just going to cut this, rough chop it, so that I can get the flavor from that fresh ginger into my broth. Fresh ginger is actually quite very potent. So if I were to use this in a dish that I was intending for people to eat the ginger, I would want to cut this incredibly small, maybe even grate it. Consider putting it in a blender with something so it's very, very small, because it is really, really potent, really, really flavorful. But like I said, I'm just trying to get this into chunks so I can get it into my broth. So you don't want the skin on your ginger, and there's a couple different ways you can take the skin off. The skin comes off really easy. I'm just using a spoon, and as you run the edge of the spoon down the ginger, the skin starts to come off. Kind of hard to see with this not focusing like I want. You could also, if you wanted to, just use a paring knife, or even just a peeler. I guess a peeler would probably do the trick too. You could also just use a paring knife and just gently shave the skin off. The nice thing about the spoon though is because it just really takes the skin off and you're not losing any of the usable product of your ginger. So there really is very little waste when you use the spoon, because all you're left with is usable parts. The skin comes off. So the ginger is 1 tablespoon. So I will literally just give it a few slices here. I can go a little further and kind of make some sticks. One tablespoon is what I'm looking for here. I think that'll do it. So really quite chunky. Like I said, I'm straining it out. But if you were to go and eat a chunk like this or like this, doesn't matter which one, it's going to be very potent. You're going to taste ginger for many hours to come. So especially raw ginger, it's just super, super potent, very delicious, and it's a great ingredient in things. But just be aware that raw ginger, when it's big like that, if you're kind of biting into a chunk, it's all you're going to taste for a couple hours. Okie doke. So I have my garlic, my ginger, I have my quart of beef stock, 1 each star anise. So star anise, see if I actually have a star here. It actually is star shaped. It's really quite pretty. There's kind of a star. Getting to the bottom of, I've got a lot of broken pieces here, but it looks like a star, and it has little pods inside each one of those little fingers of the star. There's one that's fallen out. Come on, it's kind of shiny and pretty looking. So inside that star anise, you kind of have a little pod there. So we're going to use a whole star anise. So we just need 1 star anise. And this has kind of like a licorice type flavor to it. Just use that guy there. But it has a licorice type flavor to it. When people smell it, they often just, what is that familiar smell? What's that familiar smell? The familiar smell is licorice. So it's similar to licorice. Then coriander. We need 3 whole coriander seeds. 1, 2, 3, just 3 of those little guys there. I'll put it in there. These guys back. Put the lid on before I spill it. And then now I'm ready for everything to get my broth started. My soy sauce and my fish sauce are going to be final flavoring components when my stock or my broth is done. So I'm going to wait on the fish stock or the fish sauce and my soy sauce. So we're going to be finishing touches for flavor. All right, so getting started for my broth. All my mise en place is ready to go. I've got my 1 teaspoon of vegetable oil in there. You can probably see it in there in the bottom of my pan. There we go. All right, now that you can finally get some gas coming out of your lines there, we want to have kind of a medium heat because we are going to gently saute our items in here. We can get a little bit of a color on our onion and maybe our garlic, but we don't want a ton, and we definitely don't want to be burning our product that's going into our broth. So I'll do a medium heat. So with our first step here, it starts with making the broth. In a large pot, add the oil and cook the onions. So your first blank is onions. On a medium heat until you get a light brown color on them. Once the onions have some color, we're going to add the garlic and the ginger. Onions, garlic and ginger. The star anise and the coriander, because remembering we have a spice here, so we want to add this at the beginning of cooking, kind of get it tossed with that oil a little bit, wake it up. The oil will kind of help get any of these extra oils that might be in this nice dry spice we have into our flavorful broth. Then we're going to carefully add the beef broth and let it simmer for 20 minutes, and then we'll strain out the vegetables and our whole spices. So your third blank is whole spices. And return the broth to the heat. We'll add the fish sauce, soy sauce, taste and adjust seasoning if needed. So your last blank in step 1 is adjust seasoning. Again, we've been talking a lot about adjusting seasoning. We can always taste and then adjust our seasoning. All right, so onion goes in. Hear a little bit of a sizzle. It's a good sign. We want to hear some sizzling. And then, like the recipe says, a nice light golden brown. If you feel like this is too hot too fast, turn it down. And then remembering, so I have these smaller items set aside. I do want to kind of get a little bit of color on my onion, but I don't want to be burning my smaller items here. So I'll let my onion have a head start. And then I can add all my other items. So we'll just leave this on this medium heat. I'll kind of keep pushing the onions around for a little while because I want to get a nice light golden brown color on them before I move on to my garlic and ginger. Alright, so I'm starting to get a little bit of color on the bottom of my pan and a little bit of color on my onions. My onions are starting to see a little bit of a light golden brown, and that's okay. I don't need to go crazy with this with a lot of caramelization, but a little caramelization is going to be good. So I'll go ahead and add my ginger and garlic. And that only took maybe 2 or 3 minutes to get that onion that brown. Not very long. And then of course as my garlic and ginger is in here getting aromatic. My onions are still going to be doing their caramelization thing. Get my dry spices in there. And then just be careful with how dark the bottom of your pan is getting, because I can still see some color coming on the bottom of my pan. And right now it's okay, this nice golden brown, that caramelization, good. Caramelization is going to be flavor that I'm building onto my broth. Carbonization, remember, is bad. Carbonization when we're burning, that's going to be adding bitterness to my dish. So I'm going to be careful that I'm not getting burnt bottom, but caramelized on the bottom of the pan. So then now when I add my beef broth, just be really careful. Expect a lot of noise, expect a lot of steam, because now I'm adding a nice cold liquid to my hot pan that has a little bit of oil into it. So do that carefully, and then, like I said, expect noise, expect steam. And then what I always like to do is just take a little bit of water and kind of rinse this out so I can kind of get the extra goody bits that are on the side here. So not a ton, but like I said, just a little extra to kind of rinse out what's left. All right. So we will let this simmer for 20 minutes. And then we're going to strain out everything we put in there. So we're going to strain out the whole spices, the garlic, the ginger, the onion. We'll strain it out, and then we can start flavoring it and then getting it ready to make our soup. So we'll let this hang out. Once it comes to a simmer, then I'll start my timer for about 20 minutes. But we will let it simmer for about 20 minutes, and we'll move on. So while this is going to come to a simmer and be simmering, we'll move on to a few other things. We're going to get our spinach cleaned, and then we're going to move on to the vegetables that are going to be inside of my soup. All right, so moving on to step 2, it says clean the spinach by picking off the large, thick stems, rinsing with cold water to remove any dirt. Once clean, leave in the colander to drain and set aside. So in class, I usually just get these large, giant bunches of spinach, and they can be dirty because they aren't super washed. I can kind of see some dirt on some of these. So I just take the tie off, and I literally just split it in half and half a bunch of spinach. If you're making this at home, you could absolutely be just buying the cleaned, bagged, or in the container spinaches. That would be fine, and you could omit this step, and you probably don't need to wash it, because if you're buying it in the bag or the container, it's probably already washed. So I'm just going to get rid of bits, the thicker stems, anything that looks questionable, like if it's just kind of wilty or slimy or something, I'll get rid of that as well. And then I won't, I'll tear some of the bigger pieces. Like if I see really big leaves, I'll tear them, but I'm not going to worry too much about it, because once this spinach goes into my stock or into my broth, it's going to wilt down to nothing. So bigger leaves like this wilt down and look like this. They look really small. But you could certainly, if you have big leaves, you could simply just tear it in half, so you don't kind of have like a big giant spinach noodle in your soup. So I'm just going to keep going through, picking out the stems. Those are waste. And then I'll give this a good rinse. So when you're giving these a rinse, make sure that you're really going through all the leaves and really kind of like lifting up your spinach here and kind of making sure water is getting through all those spinach, because they're laying on each other, they're kind of folding. They can be a little hard to get all of that dirt off of them. It's kind of a sandy soil that they're in, so as I'm cleaning them, I'm starting to feel a little kind of grit on my fingers, so I can tell dirt's in there. Though I can't see it all, I can certainly feel it. So make sure you're washing them pretty thoroughly. All right, I think everything else that's left here is not stuff I want to eat. So I'm going to take this to the sink and then give it a rinse. Cool water, not warm, not lukewarm or hot water. It's going to wilt it prematurely. So make sure that you are doing cool water and, like I said, kind of agitating it, stirring it around to get all of that dirt off of there. All right, so step 3 says prep all the vegetables as indicated above, because I'm going to move on to my vegetable section. So all the whole vegetables that I'm going to saute and flavor that'll go inside my broth for my soup. So step 3, prep all the vegetables as indicated above in a saute pan over medium heat. Add the 2 oils and heat. So let's focus on that first sentence there. Let's prep our vegetables as indicated on the list there. I'm going to need 1 teaspoon of vegetable oil, 2 teaspoons of sesame oil. I'm going to use the other half of that onion. So half an onion julienne. I'm going to use half a carrot, peeled and cut on the bias. I'm going to use 1 celery stalk, cut on a bias. 1 clove of garlic, chopped. And then we'll use some 5 spice. And then we'll need to get some green onions cut to garnish our finished products. Okie doke. So my half onion julienne. We're gonna just do the same thing that we did to get it ready for the broth. Cut that root end off, I don't need that. And then I just want to be really sure that I have really nice julienne cuts, because I will saute this and these julienne cuts are gonna be kind of floating around my soup. So I want them to be smaller, not giant chunks. Even cuts make our dish look pretty too. Carrots. So it says half a carrot peeled and cut on a bias. I might do the whole thing. I don't know, this is kind of a small carrot. Cut off the ends. Alright, so regardless if I'm using the whole carrot or not, I still want to cut it in half, because I come back to that situation where I have a roly-poly vegetable and I want it to be safe and secure on the cutting board for myself, so I'm going to cut it in half lengthwise. If you do have a carrot that's really quite long, I would suggest maybe cutting it in half this way first before I would tackle cutting it in half this way, especially if it's longer than your knife. It just can be kind of dangerous and daunting to cut it that way. So because this is a little short guy, I'll just cut it in half. And then again, I have that flat spot for my carrot to sit, so while I cut it. So it says that I want to cut this on the bias. Well, what does that mean? The bias cut is at an angle cut. So I could be making cuts just straight up and down, and I have little half moons. But with the bias cut, is I'm turning the products and my knife just a little bit at an angle, and now I have something that's just a little bit more visually appealing, and it looks just a little bit nicer. And again, these are going, I'm going to do the whole one. This didn't seem to make a lot, so I'm just going to do the whole one of my tiny carrot I have. But like I said, if you have a bigger carrot, you can do half. Maybe you like carrot, you can throw the whole thing in there if you got a lot. So making sure that these are thin, even size, because we are going to saute these. They are going to be cooked in our soup, so we do want to focus on having a finished product where they're evenly done, and we don't have giant, thick pieces of carrot that are still being crunchy in our soup, while we have other pieces that are maybe burnt, not doing so hot. So we want to be careful with our consistency of cuts. And then same thing with my celery. So my celery, I want to get it, I'm going to trim the ends off, and then I'm going to definitely wash it. So that has the same instruction, cut on the bias. With the celery, you have a couple different options to cut on the bias. We have that same action of just cutting on the bias this way. And you have something kind of pretty and unique. But the other option that you could do is you could carefully put it towards the end of the cutting board. And you can see how my knife is kind of angled towards my fingers. It's kind of not always the most favorable position for a knife to be towards your fingers. But with that bias cut, you just get something a little different. But with either cut, it's just a lot better than that straight up and down kind of a predictable celery cut that you might see. So just something a little different, a little nicer to the eye. Making sure you've cut them all the way through and you actually have separate pieces there. As I'm cutting my vegetables and doing my mise en place, they're in separate bowls. They're not going in the same container quite yet, because I'm going to saute them and they're going to cook at different rates there, so I want to be careful of that. So then 1 garlic clove chopped. Smash it to get that paper off, cut off the end. I'll always fish out that center germ there. And then now we can put this on the edge of our cutting board, give it a good whack, flatten it, and it just makes this chopping process a little faster. So I'm going to saute this garlic with my vegetables at the end, and it'll go in my soup. So I don't need it to be crazy tiny, but I do want to be aware I don't have giant chunks of it somewhere. Alright, so what else is on our list here? 5 spice. Let's go ahead and measure out our 5 spice. So my 5 spice, this is a great ingredient when doing kind of Asian cuisine. And a lot of people, when they smell this one, they always say, what is that smell that's so familiar? I can't seem to figure it out. There's cinnamon in 5 spice. So the 5 spices that are generally in 5 spice are going to be star anise, so it's that ground up star anise that we just used in our broth that's simmering right now. So ground star anise, ground cloves, ground cinnamon, ground Szechuan pepper, and ground fennel seeds are usually the 5 spices that make up 5 spice. And then while I got my knife out, let's get my green onion cut so I can garnish my dish when I'm done. And then we'll be done with knife work. So with a green onion, I always like to take a look, trim off the edges there. Sometimes they look a little beat up from being in the produce section or sitting in the bag there. So I have the same cut here, cut on the bias for a garnish. With the green onions, I like to do an extreme bias, so really steep angle on my green onion. And I like to take it down, just maybe down to the white, maybe sometimes a little closer too, depending on what I'm making. I think that'll be plenty. But with that extreme bias, it tends to stack up a little bit taller, and then again it gives me this really cool extreme biased shape. versus just a little circle if I were to cut that onion straight up and down. So with the extreme bias, I like it because it kind of stacks up a little bit nicer, so you can put like a pile on top of your soup. And then it gives your soup a little bit of a height because you've got a little haystack of onion on top. All right, so I think we're done with knife work. Let's go ahead and move on. So back to our step 3, we're going to prep all our vegetables. We've already done that. So our blank in step 3 is that in a saute pan over medium heat, add the 2 oils. So I have a nice saute pan. So remember when we're talking about different pans that my saute pan has this curved edge to it. It's going to help me saute and toss things around. This one just happens to have a Teflon coating, makes it pretty easy. That's not crazy important, but that shape of the pan is a little bit more important because it helps saute things. So I wanted to add my 2 oils. I happen to just already add my 2 oils in there, which was the 1 teaspoon of vegetable oil and the 2 teaspoons of sesame oil. So with my sesame oil, I have a combination of the 2 oils. I like the sesame oil. It gives a little extra flavor. It's just the toasted sesame flavor that's kind of adding a little something to my vegetables. But my sesame oil has like a lower smoke point, so I mix it with the other vegetable oil or the canola oil. It just helps with a kind of regulating the smoke point. A lot of different oils will have different smoke points, which means that when heat is applied, it's the temperature it reaches before smoke is happening and is starting to burn. Canola oil, vegetable oil has a really, really high smoke point, so it gets it can go to a really high temperature before it starts smoking. Other delicate oils, like some sesame oils, they can't handle as much heat before they start smoking. Well, when I saute, I want to have a higher heat. So when I mix the 2 oils, it kind of cuts down, like it's not a potent sesame taste, but then like I said, it kind of helps regulate my smoke point just a little bit. Not a ton, but a little bit. All right, so I have my 2 oils in there. And the rest of my steps here, it says start with sauteing the carrots first. Once the carrots are golden brown, just on the edges, I can add the onions and celery. I can add more oil if needed. So my second blank in step 3 is add more oil if needed, but be careful not to add too much. When the onions and celery are tender and you have a bit of color on them, we can add the garlic and cook until tender and fragrant, and then we're going to add the 5 spice and saute just a minute, and then we're going to turn off the heat. So the 5 spice will be the last thing that we add there. But as it says, I want to start with my carrot. So my carrot is going to go first, because when I look at the vegetables I have, is the carrot, celery, and onion. My carrot is going to be a little bit more denser and a little bit more crunchy. So I want to make sure it gets done first. You could saute them all separately. Saute your carrot, get it out of the pan, add more oil. Saute your onion, get it out of the pan, add more oil. Saute your celery. You could do them separately and then combine them at the end if you're worried about the doneness of them. But it's really, I think, the carrot that needs kind of that head start. It needs the head start to get a little bit more done before we add the other pieces. Because the celery and the onion kind of have a similar crunch and a similar kind of density to them before I can move on. So let me get my pans all set up and we'll start sauteing our vegetables. All right. My saute pan is preheated a little bit here. So when sauteing, you do want to start with a hot pan. You don't want to start with a cold pan so that when you saute, you can hear a sizzle. There's not a lot of moisture in my carrot, but I can see it sizzling. I'm going to wait for it to get just a little hotter. I can hear it sizzle a little bit more. Oh yeah, there we go. So I've cut these nice and thin. That was also kind of my plan when I was cutting them nice and thin, because I know I'm going to saute them. I know it's going in a soup. I know I don't want crunchy carrots in my soup. So the thinner you are able to cut your carrots, the more kind of speedy this process will be. That these will just kind of get a head start. We'll follow with our onions and celery, and then we can add our garlic and then our 5 spice. So if you're able to cut it thinner, just keep that in mind. It's going to make this process, like I said, just a little bit faster. And then you'll start to see kind of a little bit of a color come onto the edges of the carrot slices here. So I think that's good. I'm gonna go ahead and add my onion and celery. Like I said, I had nice thin carrots, so it didn't need a huge head start there, but definitely a little bit to get it started. So I have just a hair under a medium heat here. I can hear everything sizzling. That's a good sign. Once my vegetables are heating, they're gonna start to steam. So steam is a good sign, smoke is not. So again, just keeping an eye on your heat. You need to turn it down. So I can go ahead and get a little bit of caramelization happening on this pan, because caramelization is just flavor. And then just as we've done before, I'm going to add my garlic once my vegetables are pretty close to done. Once I start seeing some color on my vegetables, that's a good sign to get my garlic, because my garlic isn't going to take very long. I want my garlic in there. It'll start to get aromatic. It might get a little bit of color on it. That's okay. And then I can follow with my 5-spice in my hot pan with that oil. It'll help kind of waken that up, be very aromatic as well. And then I can just set it aside. So I'm going to go ahead and just let this, like I said, just saute a bit, shake it around a little bit. You can shake your pan around to get that saute motion. You kind of have to shimmy your stuff kind of towards the end, and then just pull your pan back. We've talked about different kind of baby steps to get to a saute. You might want to start with like some dry rice or beans or popcorn kernels or something. You can start with a piece of bread. Start flipping in a saute pan with kind of innocent things. So if you were to make a mess, it's not super detrimental. You're not having to clean your stove of a flopped egg or vegetables everywhere. But you can get baby steps on your saute. All right. So while my vegetables are still getting some color on them, been here for a few moments. I can go ahead and strain my stock or my broth now, and I'm going to strain it into a smaller pot. So I have my mesh strainer here. And then now all of these delicious onions and garlic and spices and ginger is just trash. So if you want to let it kind of sit there for a little while and drain, that's okay. You can kind of push things around. Tap the side of your strainer is a good one too. Get the flavor out. I would avoid pushing. Don't be pushing it through, because then you're going to just push and kind of puree your onions in there and your spices. So I'll just leave this on a low heat. And then if we go back to my step 1, is that I needed to add my finishing steps of that fish sauce and my soy sauce. So while my vegetables are still doing their thing, let's get my broth finished up here. So I wanted to do a tablespoon of soy sauce. So soy sauce is salty. So if you haven't had soy sauce before, know it's very salty. And with Asian cooking, it kind of adds as my salt ingredient. So depending on what I'm making, and if it already has soy sauce in it, and I think, oh, I taste it, I want to adjust my seasoning, oftentimes I'm just going to add salt, or soy sauce, sorry. I'm going to add soy sauce as my salt component, because it's just going to give me that same reaction there. And then now my fish sauce. So my fish sauce I need 2 teaspoons. 2 teaspoons of fish sauce in here. And fish sauce is kind of what it sounds like. It's sauce made of fish. It's fermented fish. I can admit it doesn't smell the most pleasurable just in the bottle. And I wouldn't recommend just tasting it from the bottle. I don't know, maybe, I guess you could. It's not gonna be very pleasurable. A good culinarian, you know, taste all your ingredients, right? So a lot of people get turned off on it because it doesn't smell very good from the bottle, which, yes, I can agree, it doesn't smell very good in the bottle. But the flavors, with everything coming together, is very delicious. And when we adjust seasoning, you can always add more fish sauce when adjusting seasoning. It has a little bit of a salt to it, because that fish is fermented with some salt and kind of added to it. Not as much as soy sauce, but it's going to be another great flavoring component. Fish sauce also contributes to an umami flavor. Talk about umami flavor a lot with, well, really with a lot of food. But the umami flavor is kind of that fifth taste on your palate or in your mouth, in a sense. You know, we have sweet and salty and bitter and sour, but umami kind of is that whole mouthfeel. It's a lot of texture. It can be just an extra kind of flavor, and it kind of just gives that wow to a lot of foods. Mushrooms have an umami flavor. Oftentimes people will make a broth with dried mushrooms, and that contributes to an umami flavor. The fish sauce gives you an umami flavor. So even though I know it can be kind of like a little scary, and you're like, oh, this doesn't smell very good, please give it a shot, give it a try. And in your ingredients, right? In your broth, in your sauces that you're making, and they can be very tasty. I'm going to go ahead and get my garlic into my vegetables here, and then I want to taste my broth, and then I can adjust seasoning. So once I get my 5 spice in there, I want to be very quick to turn my heat off. I think I'll just turn it off now because, not that burner though. My pan's going to stay hot for a little while, and that'll kind of help wake up my spices here, but it tends to burn. It's got that cinnamon in it. It's got really fine ground herbs in there, or spices in there. So it tends to kind of have like a burnt kind of effect. So be sure that when your 5 spices going in, you are quick to turn your heat off, and you have a plan to turn your heat off very quickly so it doesn't risk burning. All right, just about ready to put everything together here. Let's taste our broth. All right, so I think it's good. I'm gonna, well, obviously as I add my vegetables and everything else, that 5 spice in there, that 5 spice is gonna give me an extra added flavor combination, so let's add those in there. And then again, tasting your broth, adjusting seasoning. So traditionally, when you're making a udon soup or a pho soup, that it's the broth that really makes it. I can add all kinds of things inside of my broth, but if my broth doesn't have a really good flavor, there's not really a lot to it. So traditionally, a lot of people will take days to be simmering the broth, making it from a stock, using bones and trimmings, making that stock really flavorful, straining that out, and then doing kind of what we just did, where we had the onions and spices and garlic and ginger, those types of things in there, and simmering it for a really long time, and really focusing on having a delicious broth base. And then we can add all kinds of vegetables and mix-ins in it. But like I said, if I don't have a really flavorful just base broth, I don't really have much more than just a regular soup or opening a can of something, right? So really focus on trying your soup, your broth, adjusting your seasoning. All right, I think that's tasty. Again, I could add more fish sauce. I could add soy sauce. If I felt like I needed salt and pepper, I could do that. So step 4, Add the cooked vegetables to the flavorful beef broth. So your blank in step 4 is beef broth. Taste again and adjust seasoning if needed with more 5 spice if desired. That's another option. You have 5 spice to add there if you feel like you want some of that. Then we're going to add the package of frozen udon noodles and let it thaw in the broth. Once the noodles are hot, add the cleaned spinach and wilt in the hot broth. My udon noodles are still in the freezer. Let me go grab them. So my noodles, I get, they're frozen. There's just a frozen package of noodles. You can definitely find like refrigerated noodles. You could definitely make your own noodles. That could be fun. But if you have a frozen kind of puck of noodles, you just want to be really careful that you're not trying to force break these, because even if I just drop this now or slam it on the counter, it's just going to go into little noodle fragments. If I want noodle fragments, okay. I don't want noodle fragments. I want nice long noodles. So I'm just going to let this hot broth just slowly thaw these noodles. And it doesn't take terribly long to get that done. But like I said, just be careful that you're not forcing breakage on your noodles, because they do just break and then you have a bunch of little tiny noodles. I personally don't like that. I want long noodles. It's already starting to kind of get a little soft, but just be a little patient. Use your spatula to kind of just encourage it and get it maybe submerged. But like I said, try not to force that. Just be a little patient. Once it does break up, again, just making sure that you don't have any, if you're using the frozen ones, you don't have any kind of hidden spots of freezer in there. So we'll just make sure this is nice and loose once it thaws. So my noodles are thawed in here. Definitely swimming around just fine. So then now my last step was to add the spinach and let it wilt in this stock here. Just like with the noodles, kind of encourage everything down. Once it gets to that hot broth, it's gonna wilt. You could add all kinds of other vegetables in here, different vegetables. You could add different kinds of cabbage, different kinds of greens, bok choy, other types of vegetables. If you have a heartier vegetable, just include that with your sautéing of the carrots or replace it. But you could definitely add all kinds of other vegetables. Different meat options you could have if you actually wanted some pieces of meat in here. I would suggest if you had chunks of meat, you could saute them on the side somehow, like saute them in your saute pan, like take your vegetables out, saute your meat, and then add them to your finished soup. That would be good. A really traditional way of serving like pho or like a noodle soup in Asian cuisine is they would slice the meat really, really, really thin. Kind of like they would freeze it first. It's easier to slice it thin when it's frozen or partially frozen. And then they would put their vegetables in the bowl, and then they'd layer some meat on top, and then they would pour their incredibly hot broth over that meat. And because the meat is sliced so thin and your stock is so hot, it cooks the meat as you pour it over the broth. And then the customer would use their chopsticks to kind of stir it in. And then that's how, like I said, a traditional way of doing that was. But like I said, your meat has to be really thin for that hot broth to be cooking it as it's pouring over. All right, one final taste here. Okay, so step 5. When noodles are thawed, dish up the soup in a bowl and garnish with the green onions. So I have a bowl here. This might be kind of like a team effort with a ladle and a tong. Might try to ladle in some of the chunkier things. It does tend to get a little messy here with all the noodles. And then use the tongs here to get some noodles in there. And then, as I mentioned with the green onions, stack the green onions nice and tall. And then now you have this really nice bowl of soup. So you have a flavorful broth, lots of great vegetables in there. The spinach is in there. It's quite a bit of spinach and it's all wilted down, but you can hardly see it. And with the flavorful broth, you won't taste it. And then a nice pile of green onions on there, and they have great noodles, so it's a great, pretty easy udon noodle soup. Go ahead and give that a try.